Our Old Testament reading is from the book of Genesis. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour. Knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Sarah and Abraham were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
My wife, Alyssa, and I were married 3.5 years ago. We both met at undergrad at Hardin-Simmons University and stayed there, the both of us, to do grad school. I worked on spiritual care while she did a doctorate in physical therapy. And her program was rigorous in ways that was hard for me to understand. She was in class from 8 to 5, solid every day. She spent all of her evenings studying for the next day of class, and on the weekends she held clinical hours. And I saw in her at that time a perseverance and a long-suffering that I couldn't help but fall in love with. It was something I had never quite seen before. I trusted that she was the kind of person that when the going got tough, she would dig in. And I saw her true. Even before we got married, we began picking out baby names. We like very different kinds of names. I like traditional boy names for girls, and so my favorite name is Tyler for a little girl. Alyssa's not a huge fan. She likes names that have a particular ring to them. She named our dog Mayberry. She likes the name Leighton for a girl, and names like Dawson and Raylan for a boy. They don't quite do it for me. But to be honest, there's not a lot of boy names that do. I really want a girl. And we planned to wait 3 years to have kids, but 2 months into our marriage, our plans changed, so I was told. Alyssa wanted a child, and I hoped she'd be happy with a dog. So we got Mayberry, an Australian Shepherd. You know, only somebody who's married less than 90 days would think that would work. And I probably should have known better after about 90 minutes. It didn't satisfy her itch, and like a contagious infection, it quickly spread. Yeah, I meant that. And before long, I was afflicted too. And there was only one cure. So we revised our well-thought-out plan and started trying to have a child. A little girl named Tyler. No, I'm just kidding. I had to slip that in there on you. We haven't decided that. And the first year of trying was pretty hard. It was harder on Alyssa than it was on me. And then our second year of trying, well, things were just really difficult all around. But then something happened last June, 2.5 years in. I was still the youth pastor at Second Baptist Church, and we had just returned from youth camp and unloaded the buses, and I had sent youth on their way, and Alyssa arrived at the church to pick me up and drive me home. And it was the same weekend last year. It was the Friday before Father's Day. And when I got in the car to go home, she handed me a card. And I thought, oh, this is sweet. She's excited to see me. And I opened the card up, and it said, Happy Father's Day. I said, what? We're pregnant. So we laughed, and we cried, and we got excited, and on the spot we decided to drive 3.5 hours straight north in the Texas Panhandle to tell my family in Borger that we were pregnant. And on that next Monday, I was flying out to Greensboro, North Carolina for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship's General Assembly, and I was sitting at Starbucks in the Atlanta airport when Alyssa called me and told me that she thought she was miscarrying. And that was tough. That was real tough. And with some help, we got through it. Or we continue to get through it. I had 2 pastors at Second Baptist who had previously shared publicly, one even shared from the pulpit, that they had had miscarriages. So I knew that 1 in 5 couples will miscarry at least once. And I was sad when it happened. And we knew where to turn and who to call. And we knew we weren't alone. And that made all the difference in the world. And if you're going through that same thing, then we want you to know that your church is here for you too. And since Alyssa and I moved to Dallas last summer, we've started going to a fertility doctor. And we've learned that 1 in 8 couples have enough trouble getting pregnant that they go to a doctor about it, and a doctor for help. And sometimes we feel like we're the only ones going through this, but we aren't. It's not uncommon. Sometimes it's easy to think that there's something wrong with us, or that it's our fault, but it isn't. These things just happen. But if it were in our power, trust me, we would do anything to fix it. And I imagine Abraham and Sarah would as well. A few chapters before our story takes place, Abraham and Sarah are promised a child that is to be their heir. A child that never came. They too must have wondered, why hasn't this happened yet? Is it my fault? Did I do something wrong? Is there something wrong with me? And then through Sarah's years of infertility grief, I'm sure she had well-meaning people in her life who said all kinds of silly things to her, trying to help fix it. They say, Sarah, you need to exercise more. Sarah, you exercise too much. Sarah, drink some wine. That always helps. Sarah, you need to stop drinking alcohol. It's a real problem. And the list only gets more intrusive from there. Her friend said, oh, I have a niece who went through this too. But after X number of years of trying, they gave up. And you know what happened? Boom, they got pregnant. So stop trying so hard. They said, don't worry. When the time is right, it's going to happen. Just have faith. But what Sarah really needed was for people to say, I'm sorry, and nothing else. And then one day, long past her window for having children had closed, 3 strange men come to her in Abraham's land. And especially from her point of view, there's nothing about these guests that indicate that they have divine knowledge. So is it any wonder that Sarah laughs when these strange men say she'll have a son? Ha! Who are these fools to make such an absurd claim? If they only knew how many times Abraham sat her down and said, Sarah, this is the year. This is the year we have a child. I can feel it. I've been praying. I have faith, Sarah, this year. And then when another year passed without a child, it was Sarah consoling Abraham while he cried and asked why. There Sarah was, holding her head up high when all her friends had children, and she didn't. There she was, standing tall with dignity, even when her friends made plans to take all of their children to the park together, and stopped inviting Sarah because it felt awkward. She's had plenty of time to watch her husband's faith falter and fail time and time again as another decade passes without a child. She hasn't seen her friends in years. Oh, all of their children have grown up now. But that spark of friendship snuffed out long ago. So yes, when strangers who don't appear to know her story or appreciate her struggle say she'll soon have a child at her age, what else can she do but laugh? But it's not the laugh of one who's heard a funny joke. It's not the laugh you would slap your knee to. No, it's a dark-humored laugh, a laugh of amusement. Because the first thing she thought of when she heard the men's proclamation was the baby name that she and Abraham picked out over 60 years ago. It's a name she hasn't thought about in years. But in the snap of the fingers, there it was on her mind, just like that. Ha! Who would have thought that? It's the snarky laugh of hearing one more well-meaning person share hollow words meant to be hopeful when Sarah has lived through too much pain to hold on to childish fantasy. There was a time when those men's words would have gotten her hopes up all over again. But too many of those times have come and gone, leaving only brokenness in their wake. Sarah's laugh is her shield against the memory of hope and the pain it brings with it. And Sarah isn't the only one who knows grief too well. As I've said, there are many like Alyssa and I who have suffered through miscarriage or the compounding grief of infertility. There are those who wanted a family but remained single. Those who married but never did have the children they hoped for. There are gay couples who want children but must navigate all kinds of difficulties to pursue that path. Those who know the horror of losing a child. And even those who have had an unplanned child and must wrestle with complex emotions as well. And there are so many more that remain unnamed. Each grief unmistakably unique. This passage is for all of us. All of us who carry with us unrealized hopes and dreams. All of us who suffer in any way without a clear end in sight. This passage is about what it takes and what happens when God takes far too long to come through for God's people. This is a major theme throughout the Bible. The Hebrew people spend 500 years in Egyptian slavery waiting for God to free them. David is anointed king decades before he ever sits on a throne. The Israelites spend 70 years in domination and exile by the Babylonians waiting for God to remember them. The Apostle Paul writes letters telling people, stop selling all of your possessions because it doesn't look like Jesus is coming back nearly as soon as we expected. And it's not just the ancients. We live in this tension too. Jesus came as the Redeemer of the world, but one news cycle is all it takes for us to realize our world remains largely unredeemed. Scripture crowns him the Prince of Peace, yet our planet is not yet at peace. And our temptation as the same as the ancients, to either give up hope or take things into our own hands by using ungodly means in an attempt to achieve godly ends. When Sarah and Abraham are most desperate, they tried to fulfill the promise themselves when Abraham lays with Sarah's handmaid, Hagar, to produce an heir. This isn't what God promised, but it does relieve their anxiety briefly. Now let's not compare that. Let's not mistakenly compare that with going to a fertility doctor today, because obviously I think God's fine with that. We do this same sort of thing. We use ungodly means to achieve our ends when we try to do things like bring peace in our personal lives or in our families or maybe even the world. Peace, which is a good and godly thing. But when we do it by using coercion, manipulation, or violence. Or maybe it's what we do when we want to excel in our workplace, but we cut corners to do so. Or maybe we put far too much pressure on our significant other or our children to be perfect because we so desperately want to have a great family. Whatever our it may be, it's probably good. It's even a God-given desire, but it's taken too long to get here. And in our impatience, we either lose hope and give up, or we give in and begin to use ungodly means to get there. It's what we do when instead of turning the other cheek, we say an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. When instead of forgiving, we hold on to offense and use it like a weapon. And both make us feel powerful and relieve our anxiety, briefly. But ultimately, when ungodly means are used with good intentions, they never achieve their hoped-for end for long. Abraham and Hagar's son exposes Sarah and Abraham's shame instead of being the promised heir. And in the long run, our violence and our unforgiveness brutalize us, and the corners that we cut catch up to us, and the unrealistic pressure we put on others always backfires. And in the long run, our violence only begets more violence, and our unforgiveness will brutalize us. We must content ourselves to move forward at God's pace, even when it's slow, and in God's ways. And for reasons I don't understand, God moves painfully slow. But because of what I see in Jesus and at the cross, I believe we have a God who knows all too well what the problem is and doesn't turn a blind eye to it, but is willing to do something about it and get God's own hands dirty, so to speak, and to face it. And that doesn't fix today's suffering, but it does give us strength to endure and press on. And we put our trust in God when, despite our difficulty, we follow the path of Christ, turn the other cheek, and allow our suffering to be redeemed. Our faith doesn't make us immune to suffering. Our faith gives us the strength to get through it. We will suffer in this life, whether we're like Jesus or not. Whether we're Christian or not, we will suffer. And the example of Christ gives us the path to follow, and the presence of the Spirit gives us the power, all to suffer well. That's the choice we get to make. Not whether we suffer or whether we don't suffer, but whether we suffer well. All is not as it should be in our life and in our world. God is not a genie to be manipulated into feeling our wishes, though sometimes I so wish it were. Alyssa and I are not promised a child. We're promised that God will be with us in the struggle. We're all promised that if we trust God and follow the path of Jesus, then we can be at peace, even when our world isn't. Amen.